So the Tavistock Gender Identity Clinic in London is due to close in the next few weeks. It was the NHS's only such facility for children and young people, and the decision to shut the clinic follows an independent review into gender identity services. Hannah Barnes has written a book about the Tavistock, and I'm delighted to say she joins me now. Hannah Barnes, welcome to the show. So for those watching who don't know about the Tavistock Gender Clinic and why it was shut, what were the main problems there?
There were many. I mean, one was that we had, as you said, one national service for England and Wales and that's it.
That's it. Right.
So they were completely overwhelmed with the numbers that were being referred, which dramatically increased from 2009 onwards and
Yes.
really had this sort of explosion around 2015. So they haven't been able to cope with the numbers. The independent review that you mentioned, undertaken by Dr. Hilary Cass, has said that one service model isn't sustainable and it is unsafe, and there needs to be a fundamental rethink. Now, we've had a hint at what the new services replacing the Gender Identity Development Service will be, which sort of talk to what the problems were. So one is there needs to be far more holistic, Dr. Cass has said, so taking into account any other difficulties that young people might be experiencing. And this is what, you know, many clinicians have said, that young people presenting, of course, were distressed or around their gender or had gender incongruence, but there was so much else going on besides.
So you've mentioned other issues, you know, issues such as you note that between, I think, 80 and 90% of those referred were same-sex attracted, so they might be dealing with...
Well, we've got really limited data, and this is part of the problem surrounding the service generally.
Yes.
So that comes from one referral year, 2012, of those who were of the older ages, so over 12. But yeah. Those were just...
And also the preponderance of those suffering from autism within the pool, and also other issues. But a lot of the critics will say, but if you start this sort of explorative therapeutic process, that's a form of trans-conversion therapy. That's what the accusation is.
Yep.
And indeed, there are moves to outlaw that. Is that something that concerns you?
Well, all I can say is that many clinicians who have worked there say that what many of those young people needed was more explorative therapy. They weren't saying they would rule out physical transition at all, but they were saying that some of the assessments were too quick, and they just couldn't take in anything else that was going on. If they were, you know, a very few number were 2 sessions, but even in the 3 to 6 session model that GIDS followed, they just said, well, that's really not that much time to explore all that might be going on. And it wasn't about ruling out puberty blockers, as we colloquially know them, at all. It was about whether it was trying to make sure that if that decision were taken, that it was the right one, or as right as it could be. So, and you know, and even GIDS themselves say that exploratory talking therapy is not conversion therapy.
So, well, that's a really important point, isn't it? Because the accusation seems to be that Tavistock has been adopting the affirmative model insofar as a child says, I think I'm in the wrong body, and they affirm that rather than explore possibilities. So that seems to be at the heart of this problem, isn't it?
Well, I think the difficulty was that what emerged was sort of a clinician's lottery, and it's something that Dr. Cass has noted in her report. So there was no consistency across the service. So you could have some clinicians, what you might call the more affirmative model, so an assessment would be quite quick. But other clinicians were conducting their assessments over, you know, maybe 20, 30 appointments, and that's something that the Care Quality Commission found. So it wasn't... And this is where the problems emerged, because depending on how one viewed the young people in front of them, it would really shape how you helped them.
So they're not keeping records particularly well, and they have completely different approaches depending on the clinician in question. I mean, and you're hearing stories from some people who have now detransitioned saying there were 1 or 2 face-to-face meetings and they were on the path. That can't be...
Well, I've spoken to, you know, several young people. They're all young adults now for the book. Some of whom are very happy. I have to stress that people have had really positive experiences there, and some of whom, frankly, have been harmed, and really badly harmed. You know, one of them has detransitioned now. She's doing really well, actually. But she said, look, her assessment was so lacking in any thoroughness. You know, she'd had a same-sex relationship. She'd been made to feel quite ashamed about that prior to her identifying as trans. She'd had some really quite bad mental health problems, disordered eating. You know, all these things that weren't really considered in her 5 appointments. You know, she was at the older end of the she was sort of 16, 17 when she was seen, so she went straight to adult services, got testosterone at her first appointment, because her GIDS assessment was taken as gospel, she says. But actually, that assessment wasn't very good in her case.
I mean, that's really worrying. I mean, let's talk about that, the same-sex attracting issue, insofar as I've spoken to a number of gay activists who've sort of come out of retirement because they're now seeing these sort of old regressive ideas. You know, there's this correlation between gender nonconformity in youth and homosexuality in later life. It's not an exact science, but there's a strong correlation. Yeah. And, you know, whistleblowers at the Tavistock have talked about how homophobia could have been the driving force behind a lot of these things. Effectively, you're fixing gay kids to make them more in line with heterosexual assumptions.
Well, that was the fear, and I think it's really important to say that that was obviously not the intention and it wasn't a conscious thing, but it might have been that was the result. And I think, you know, one of the clinicians I spoke to in the book, and I have to say, I think it's a myth that the only people concerned about this were clinicians who were gay themselves. Absolutely not the case. The vast majority said that so many of the young people they saw had been same-sex attracted.
Yes.
Or were same-sex attracted, but obviously didn't identify with their natal sex. But we know one of the clinicians I spoke to, Dr. Matt Bristow, raised exactly the same point you're saying, that actually many of the behaviours in childhood which might indicate a trans outcome in adulthood would also indicate a gay or lesbian or bisexual outcome in adulthood. And that seemed to be being forgotten because this was a gender service and everything was being viewed through the prism of gender. And he said it was... He and others were trying to impress that upon their colleagues that, you know, it might be that young person would grow up to be trans, but actually it's also a really strong indicator they might grow up to be gay.
And what happened when these clinicians raised these concerns internally?
Well, two things. So one is there would be lots of talk. So it wasn't that there was no opportunity to talk, but then nothing would happen in some cases. And the other thing that would happen is that in some cases these clinicians would be sort of scapegoated, they've used that term with me, that branded troublemakers and not necessarily always in an overt way, but then somewhere or other they would leave the service because they tried to raise these concerns over and over again, and not just within GIDS, but within the wider Tavistock Trust itself. And then, you know, they took those concerns out of the trust, but they did so for years and years and years, over and over again, to numerous people. And effectively nothing changed. Is
that part of a broader problem with the discourse surrounding gender identity, insofar as those who raise concerns, these kinds of concerns, are often branded as being hateful or transphobic, and therefore their views are automatically dismissed?
Well, I think one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is that if you're sort of the average partly engaged layperson, you might think that there's no lack of agreement in how best to care for this often distressed, vulnerable group of young people. And where there is disagreement, it's motivated by transphobia, but nothing could be further from the truth. And in gender clinics, you know, here, but in Europe and in the US, we've started to see now, there is lack of agreement on how best to treat each and every one of these young people. You know, for some, it may well be, and it seems to be, a physical transition, but for many, was what these clinicians were saying, it won't be. And GIDS was very geared up to helping those for whom it would work, and not those for whom it wouldn't, is what they say. And yes, and I think they've said to me that the word gender here just muddied the waters. It meant that, as Dr. Cassis said, that the service didn't receive the level of oversight one would expect from NHS England. And from others, from our regulators, from our politicians, from the media. I
think a lot of people listening to what you're saying, I mean, will be thinking, you know, but we're dealing with very young people. People who are prepubescent surely shouldn't be able to make these decisions that might affect the rest of their lives. And also, is it not the case that most of these feelings of dysphoria are resolved naturally through puberty, the very puberty that is, in fact, a halt is put on it by these drugs?
Well, a few things there. So you can't be prepubescent and go on the blocker. You have to have at least got
started.
to... you have to have started. You have to have got to what they call Tanner stage 2. And while it is the case that some very young children have commenced treatment with the blocker, sort of 9-year-olds have been referred, 10-year-olds have certainly started.
In the UK?
In the UK. But the numbers at that lower end are very, very small. So partly because of the length of GIDS's waiting list, the majority are sort of 14, 15, you know, adolescents rather than that lower age bracket. Older studies in this, albeit they're all flawed. I mean, the evidence base is very, very weak. It's sort of small number of participants, no long-term follow-up, did seem to show that, in the majority of cases, the gender incongruence would resolve as a young person went through puberty. Some in the trans community would say, well, that evidence base doesn't apply to this group of young people. But, that old evidence base actually is the evidence base that is used to justify the treatment as well. So I think it's difficult to... That is what the old studies showed, but all the studies are flawed, they're small.
So we need better studies, right?
Sure,
and we need more discussion. Well, hopefully your book is an important step on the way to that. Hannah Barnes, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.